Alright guys, let's get started. So today we are very lucky to have Professor Acharya, the Professor of Economics at NYU Stern, join us. Before that, he was the Deputy Governor at the Reserve Bank of India from 2017 to 2019. So basically India's Jerome Powell. And he's right now the academic advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Philly Board of Governors, advised the IMF, World Bank, and former director of the National Stock Exchange of India. So please give it up for Professor Acharya.
Yeah, I always like it when the claps are at the beginning because you might not clap at the end.
So, Professor, you right now have, or very recently wrote a book about India's need to restore financial stability. And India right now is coming to be one of the most promising developing countries in the world, especially given that a lot of these developed countries are expected to have low growth, some even recessions. So what do you mean by the need for India's, what do you mean by India's need to restore financial stability? What does that look like? And what is going wrong and what should they do to fix it?
Yeah, so India is sort of very interesting in many ways, like there's a book on India called The Holy Cow, and like one of the sayings in the book is that everything that's true about India, the opposite is also true. And I think that is actually true, which is that, so clearly India is at some level, the growth bastion of the world right now, fast growing, it has the right demographics in terms of population growth. If you think about what technology can do to our cities, to our second tier cities, third tier cities, villages, how much infrastructure can be built in India in different parts. It's like, you could do your entire undergrad on what are the opportunities in India, just documenting those. But what happens is, there's a little bit of a trap, which is that countries like India, Brazil, they are perennially the country of the next decade. But at some level, if you achieve that, you should shift out of that bucket. You should move to some other country, hopefully takes your chance if you are able to migrate out of that. And what happens in these countries is that they go through these cycles of leverage boom and busts. Suddenly, there's a huge expansion, a lot of credit gets allocated, typically in infrastructure, but it could very often also be in real estate. Sometimes, it's only to a few large companies. Sometimes it is across board. Sometimes it is to government affiliated entities. But invariably, these leverage booms then go bust very quickly, like within 3 or 4 years. So you get like a growth spurt. Suddenly growth looks like 8%, 9% per annum. And then boom, it all comes to like a screeching halt. And that's because you realize that actually the underwriting standards of banks for making loans, the ability of capital markets to allocate funds efficiently to the deserving borrowers, write the correct terms, monitor the projects along the way, these things are sort of still a bit rudimentary. And on top of that, when there is a government push saying, no, we must deliver an X% growth, especially over the next term or next year when a national election is coming due, then it's like all hell breaks loose because India, like many other emerging markets, has state-owned banks, it has state-owned insurance companies, it has a power finance company that's run by the government, it has a rural electrification company that's run by the government. All of them raise financing of their own. And essentially, you get what I consider as like a directed lending in the economy. It's not that banks are deciding who to lend money to based on their credit quality, but someone is actually pushing you from the back saying, give a loan to XYZ, give a loan to ABC. Earlier, it used to be as brazen as that, which is you would get a phone call. It was called phone banking, which is that you get a phone call saying like lend XYZ to this business. Now they said it, do it more like targets, like you have to achieve so much lending target in a given year. Of course, China is probably the most common example of these kinds of targets. The four largest state-owned banks in China, they lend very heavily to state-owned enterprises of China. You could argue that that is how China has achieved its infrastructure miracle, but that is also why Chinese banks have huge non-performing assets, and right now, even their housing sector is actually not doing very well, and so on. So to cut a long story short, it feels like there's a lot of underlying potential because of the demographics, because of low levels of per capita GDP, low consumption, which means that if you can expand the ability of these societies to have infrastructure, have growth, opportunities, they can become wealthy, then they will consume a lot. The entire world wants India to grow right now because, and other emerging markets, because they think that's how their companies can actually partake where the opportunities are. But the challenge is that the internal institutional infrastructure for finance, for allocation of capital, for ensuring that creditors can get their money back when companies are defaulting, all of this is not very well developed. And you go through these boom and bust cycles of easy money, tight money, 5 to 10 years of banks having to clean up their non-performing assets, and that kind of shunts growth for a while, and then it's harder to keep going back to your potential because you're always doing a catch-up rather than actually saying, okay, I have my infrastructure in place, I have good capital markets, my banks have good underwriting standards, why don't I enable the private sector now by making it easy for them to do business? The markets will then sort out the allocation of capital, and then gradually we can be steadily on a high path growth rather than through this fits and starts, which are more politically driven, government push driven, and then you then continuously remain the country of the next decade, so to speak. So the context when I joined India was that such a leverage boom had happened during 2009 to 2011-12, and Indian banks were basically sitting on, I think, on paper about 10 trillion rupees of bad loans, which in today's terms is basically like a serious, like in tens of billions of dollars basically. But that's just on paper. Actual losses would have been even higher, which they had not yet recognized. And typically when something like this goes bad, no one wants to take the bull by the horns. Everyone's interested in, can you just move to the next year with a little bit of lending still happening? Let's not clean up the banks in a big way, because maybe in the period of the cleanup, you can't simultaneously be doing a lot of lending in the first place. You have to focus on the cleanup. Then when the cleanup is complete, the balance sheet is in a position to make fresh loans and be ready to absorb some losses. So no one wants to take that pain, because in India, for those of you who are not aware, it's not just a national election. There are state elections happening in India practically every year, in fact every 6 months or so. And so I feel India is almost like perpetually in an election mode. So that means that with the kind of institutions we have, where there are state-owned banks, state-owned insurance companies, regulators don't have as much operational autonomy as in many advanced economies. You are constantly being told, oh, but you want to do all these long-term reforms and fix the country, but I have an election to fight over the next 6 months. So why don't you help me rather than making India the country of the next decade? So I think to me that's the real challenge, that the financial stability, which is this leverage booms going bust and then losses not being resolved in a quick manner, is ultimately tied to the political cycle of the country. In fact, there's a very nice paper from a Harvard Business School professor who showed that farm lending in India is not correlated with the cycle of the temperature or the season of lending, etc. It's linked actually to the political cycle of the country. when an election is coming up, you get a lot of farm loans. When an election is coming up, you forgive farmers' loans which have gone bad, because this is the way you try to get the votes on the final day. So that's the real challenge, to keep the politics in check, have institutional reforms which allow markets, banks, insurance companies, regulators to function reasonably independently, and third, to not go through this constant leverage boom and bust cycles which generate growth spurts and then growth collapses, but instead find like a way to grow steadily for a decade or two, because that's how real prosperity happens. Now, I don't want to just say that nothing has happened in India. I think since 90s, India has done phenomenally well. I would say the growth rates were fantastic till the global financial crisis, almost averaging 7 to 8% per annum. It's hard for a large country like that to do that. China, of course, grew at close to 10% per annum for 3 decades. But you can see that even for a country like China, the growth numbers have now come down to almost 2 to 3% per annum. In fact, the last print, I believe, was just 3, I believe, maybe even 2, I don't remember now. But it's very low, and I think the problem is debt. There's just too much debt on everyone's balance sheet in the Chinese economy. Thankfully, in India, due to some efforts that we undertook and some others undertook, we seem to have cleaned up the banking system, but I don't think politically everything is necessarily fixed. India is still sort of a thriving democracy in every sense of that term, which is we have elections happening every now and then, but elections are also driving a lot of what's happening in the economy every now and then. So on that front, I still have a question mark whether we are really truly insulated from the political economy. We have a national election coming up next year, in fact. And it's been, as you can imagine, it's been somewhat of a rocky COVID period. Growth numbers are slowing a bit, even though India is still the country of next year, not just next decade, even next year. IMF is like very gung-ho about India's growth prospects. But what that means is it's really important this year to deliver a high growth number, and we have to wait and see what that means. Does it mean that we will start splurging liquidity all over the economy, giving loans at some point where perhaps it's not necessary? Will we make big infrastructure pushes? Infrastructure loan is a great thing to do in the year before an election. You'll find out about the project 4-5 years down the line. So in the year of the election, if you make a big, massive infrastructure push, it looks like tremendous activity is being created in the economy. But the question is, what is the underwriting standards of that loans? Is someone being asked and forced to make certain loans? Are some companies asked to do projects which they wouldn't have otherwise done because they are under a little bit of duress from the government to build infrastructure in an election year? I think these are the questions we have to watch out for.
So to that point, is it fair to say that the Central Bank of India is under more political pressure than, for example, the Federal Reserve here in the US? What role does politics play, and what role will the national election play in the fact that the retail inflation report was higher than the RBI's goal this past fall?
Yeah. So certainly, so I would say, if you take a historical stretch, for sure, I would say the Reserve Bank of India has been at certain points of time under just tremendous political pressures. Now, this is not to say that there haven't been Federal Reserve governors who haven't been under similar pressure. In fact, one of the US presidents, Lyndon Johnson, after John Kennedy, he's known to have actually had a brawl with the central bank governor. He pushed the governor against the wall when he said, "I will not cut interest rates for you." So, but you can, if you have read anything about Lyndon Johnson, that would be perfectly normal and expected behavior. Paul Walker said that when he was raising interest rates, so US had very high double-digit inflation rates in late 70s, early 80s, and Paul Walker is considered as the man who, through persistence and just sort of sheer weight of force against the political pressures, raised interest rates to double-digit levels and said, no, I have to bring inflation down to a 2% target. I really can't let it go in the 10% territory. In his memoir, he said that he was called by President Reagan in his office. He was explicitly told that you should keep rates low rather than high so that I can fund my expansionary manifesto, which was to cut taxes. And then if you cut taxes but the government still wants to keep spending, then they have to borrow. And then if the central bank keeps rates low, at least for a while, at the short end of the term structure, you can borrow at low cost. But he said, no, I won't do that. And he wasn't fired. So to me, that's a sign that there was political pressure, but the central bank governor could still say no. In India, in many cases, however, that's not been the case. When governors have said no, they've either not been renewed or they resign without necessarily a lot of explanation as to what happened. But I would say over a period of time, things are still moving in the direction of more operational autonomy, and you have to institutionalize things. So you mentioned about inflation. So what Fed did, following the model of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, was that in 80s and 90s, the Federal Reserve itself adopted inflation targeting framework, saying that no, it's in the legal mandate of the Federal Reserve. There's an act in which there's a clause which says that the Federal Reserve has to target inflation as its primary objective, while also looking for having full employment in the economy. Now, India didn't have such a structure until 2016. In 2013, efforts were started under then Governor Raghuram Rajan to say, okay, we should operate in this way, even though we don't have a legal structure. And then they worked on a committee report, and then now we have a Reserve Bank of India amendment to the Act, which is called the Monetary Policy Committee Act. And what does that say? It says that, okay, there'll be a committee, 3 people from the Reserve Bank, 3 people appointed by the government from outside, that's in charge to target the CPI, the consumer price inflation, at 4% in a band of plus minus 2%. The central bank can use the dial of its policy rate to achieve that. If it violates the band for 3 quarters in a row, then the governor has to give a written explanation as to why they failed to meet the mandated targets of inflation. Now, but to just give you a historical perspective, Dr. Subbarao, who was the governor of Reserve Bank of India during 2007 to 13 or 8 to 13, his memoir was called Who Moved My Interest Rate? Okay. You can see why it was called that. The finance minister, he was referring to the finance minister. Then prior to that, Dr. Y.V. Reddy was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. His book was called Advice and Dissent. It's like this other very diplomatically worded, as you can see. And Raghuram Rajan's book was called I Do What I Do. And Dr. Y.V. Reddy actually he was a very witty person. There are lots of aphorisms attributed to him, but one of the famous ones is that in an interview he was asked, do you have operational autonomy from the government? And he said, I have full operational autonomy and I have finance minister's permission to say so. So that sort of gives you the picture of how the independence of the central bank has been evolving. I think my term was particularly interesting. I think what happened is that I joined on January 2017. One of my sort of many episodes and situations of bad timing was that I joined right after demonetization was done. Fortunately, not in the midst of demonetization. I joined on January 20th of 2017.
For those who don't know what demonetization was.
Yeah, I think, do most of you got demonetized? Demonetization was that in India there were 2 large notes of 500 rupees and 1000 rupees, and the government wanted officially to crack down on black money, so they said these large notes through which black money exchanges hands, from 9th November onwards, you cannot do any transactions in this for the next 50 days. They are illegal tender. We are going to produce a new tender. So if you have 500 and 1000 rupee notes, sorry, you know. But of course, in the end, all the money got laundered through whatever channels were available. 99.9999, I don't know into what percent, what digit it changes from 9 after the decimal place, but 99.999 something percentage of all the currency ultimately found its way through the banking system and got converted into white. And Indians are the masters of this. Yeah, it's like there's a term in India called jugaad, and the biggest jugaad is like in converting money from black into white and white into black, and you know, it's like a whole. Yeah, anyway, someone should do a PhD dissertation on, you know, is it in the DNA, or you know, is it something you acquire through your family, or you just like osmosis from the rest of the system that, you know. Like you become a teenager and you've already figured it out, you know, like how to do this. I don't know. But what happened is, so I joined on 20th January 2007. Oh, by the way, my day of inauguration was the same as the day of inauguration of President Trump. That's sort of another big achievement I have, you know. So the difficulty was that demonetization, because India was a very heavily cash-run economy. And it's still, in parts of India, a very heavily cash-run economy, villages, rural, semi-urban places. And not just that, like recently in a December trip, I learned that a lot of insider trading that's done by big businesses and CEOs and their owners, they settle the insider trading trades in cash. So there's a lot of cash apparently with like the CEOs of large companies, because if they are doing insider trading by giving information to someone, apparently they settle it on the side in cash so that there's no trail of this and so on. So anyway, there's always some interesting new facts about India I learn every time I go. But so demonetization slowed the economy. A lot of people went through a lot of hassles. Small businesses especially got really clobbered during that time, because they were not used to doing things in non-cash, they were not digitally savvy, many of them probably didn't even have computers actually to figure out how to do these things digitally. So they were really clobbered, and what that meant was, the government really needed to change the narrative. They needed to show that this was not a spectacular failure, even if it was in its original intentions. You know, the government has other ways to like generate growth, and they did it. And of course, that meant that they really wanted low interest rates. And so the problem was inflation targeting had just been legally implemented just before demonetization was done. So now we have told the world that, oh, my central bank is going to target an inflation rate of 4%, and then you have dropped a sort of a bomb on the side at the same time. And you know, the central bank is now really caught between a rock and a hard place as to how to navigate the political pressures with what's actually your legal mandate. So we came under a lot of pressure, but because the legal mandate makes it so easy for you to say no. On things where there's a legal mandate, you can just tell the government, sorry, I'm legally required as a technocrat to achieve this objective. There's a process for it. I have to vote on this monetary policy. I have to release my minutes to the public as to why I voted the way I did. And I won't use the term, but something of yours is on the line, you know. That's what I'm trying to say. And you know, that sort of brings a lot of discipline to the process. But there are many things where there isn't such institutional framework. And then if the government can't push one button, they start pushing random other buttons, hoping that something will start working there, you know. Like there's an Indian phrase for it called tukkagiri, you know, like tukka is like a random shot, you know, like you just like, you don't know how to do the dart, but you just like keep throwing and something, you're hoping something will stick in the bullseye. Yeah, exactly. So then you start pushing a lot of buttons and hope like something will happen. And then it becomes very chaotic, because every day you come up with like a brilliant bad idea, you know. and you're like, how do I keep these folks at bay, you know, like how do we prevent this idea from being announced tomorrow morning out of the government's office or the finance ministry or whatever. No, I'm not exaggerating. This is exactly how I used to sleep. Like, how do we prevent this from happening tomorrow morning? Like this is the mission for the day. Like, how can you like push this idea off for a while? Now, coming to the current situation, so inflation is high right now. It's, I think the latest print was 6.5%, I believe. But I think the bigger problem is that the core inflation, which is without food and fuel, that's hovering around 6 or above 6% now for, I would say, more than a couple of years. And this core inflation is a better reflection of where underlying demand of the economy is in terms of its ability to generate growth without necessarily hitting into labor scarcity, skill scarcity, supply frictions and so on. Both in United States, other developed economies and emerging markets, essentially core inflation, because it's like an underlying demand-driven inflation, the headline inflation, which has the supply shocks of food and fuel, always keeps gravitating back towards the core inflation because supply shocks don't last forever. Even though the recent oil price shocks have been longer than perhaps could have been, transportation cost shocks because of COVID have been longer lasting than they have been. Still, ultimately, headline inflation is coming back towards core inflation. And what has happened is the world over, central banks, to support their governments to deal with COVID, lowered interest rates, pumped in a lot of liquidity, bought government bonds, bought mortgage-backed securities, bought corporate bonds. So they all sort of put the economy on steroid. And then, as is usual, the analogy I like to give is when you are in a new hotel, every time you're trying to figure out the shower, you end up a little bit on the hot side. You get scalded for a brief second, and then you push it back. So a little bit like that. You are in a new scenario, you are trying to figure out what to do, you overshoot and then you dial back. And something like that's happened here. But of course you have to deal with the aftermath that you're getting scalded for a process. And so inflation is high. I think the Reserve Bank, in my view, was a bit late in spite of the inflation targeting mandate that it had. Other emerging market central banks like Brazil, South Korea, they moved in much earlier with interest rate hikes. They actually preceded the Federal Reserve. They anticipated that when Fed starts hiking rates, things will get bad for the rest of the world. Our inflation is high, so we should proactively actually bring inflation down. The Reserve Bank didn't do that. They come up with forecasts, but they look too rosy. They had very low inflation forecasts. It didn't make sense given the data. So on the eve of the Federal Reserve rate hike in April 22, 12 hours before, they did an emergency, or March of 22, they did like an emergency rate hike, meeting out of sequence, etc. So I think they were a bit late, but now they are back onto the inflation targeting mandate. They violated 3/4 of 6% above inflation. So a letter was given by the governor to the government. It has not yet been disclosed to the public. I'm told it will get disclosed by the parliament or the government at some point. Hopefully it does get disclosed. I think it will be good for accountability of the system. But as of now, they are still raising rates. Last one, many thought would be the last interest rate hike, but today's print was higher than expected. And in India, what happens is, I'll just make a last point on this. I think some of you are not from India, so I have to describe this one Indian dish. It's called pav bhaji. So pav bhaji is sold on the carts we have outside. So similarly, in India, carts are selling this dish called pav bhaji. Of course, you can make it at home also. I actually make it very well. You're most welcome to have it sometime if you want. But it's basically like a dish which has a lot of vegetables, like peas, potatoes, tomatoes, onions, Indian spices. Most of them, when you have a pav bhaji, you are up till late because you can't sleep, the mind is all, you are like hyperactive with the extra metabolism that those spices are giving you. And it's usually had with like this bread, which is like it's a little bit like the bread for sliders, if you had them on the Super Bowl evening, so it's very similar to that bread. But why am I talking about this dish? Yeah, good question. I used to track an index in India called the Pav Bhaji Index of Inflation, okay, which is how much is it costing to make Pav Bhaji, because that captures the prices of vegetables. And vegetable prices in India are extremely volatile. So what happens is if your core inflation is at 6%, vegetables can cause the headline inflation to swing up and down like wildfire. So I used to find if I wanted to know core inflation, I had to ask the RBI team. But if I wanted to know how much the inflation will be around the core inflation, I had to ask my mom. How much are you going to give me pav bhaji or not? If not, then it's going to be a really high print, because all Indian moms are the best optimizers. They will only give you what costs within a budget that will not raise the eyebrows in the household as to why are we making expensive dishes. So anyway, this pav bhaji index has today turned out to be very high. Some vegetables, some cereals also, which go into an Indian dish called dal, they are also a little bit high. So food inflation in India is high because food supplies are not managed very well. India tries to not allow as much food to come from outside, and simultaneously it doesn't allow its food producers to supply outside very easily, because the government wants to keep a very tight control on the prices. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't, and so the food inflation also becomes sort of very, very volatile. So to cut a long story short, I think in a country like India, if you have to maintain a target of 4%, in my view, you have to keep core at 4% or even slightly below 4%, because every now and then this Pav Bhaji index is going to go out of whack, and it's going to throw you out of the band. And when it's going to come back, you don't necessarily know. It can be seasonal, it can be within a month. So you have to deal with these uncertainties, which are very, very large, and it's so funny. It's like when our minutes used to come out from the RBI Monetary Policy Committee, other central bankers used to ask me why do you talk about prices of vegetables so much in your policy rate decisions and inflation rate? And we said because it's a very big part of India's inflation. In India's consumer price inflation basket, 40% plus is food items, because most of India's population is poor, and a big part of consumption of poor people is food. And so India's consumption basket is heavily food driven, unlike in United States, where food is a very small part of the basket. And what that means is it's not their inflation measure is not as volatile, because people are consuming higher end goods rather than food as their primary ingredient. So very challenging situation for the Reserve Bank in my view, but if they stick the course, in my view, they have to keep raising rates until core inflation shows signs of coming down. See, in case of Fed, core is already coming down gradually over the last few months. In case of India, core inflation is not yet coming down. So that's the challenge for Reserve Bank of India. They will have to wait for signals for core inflation to come down, unless the food and cereals already whacked the inflation out before.
First of all, this is incredible. If you had told me this morning we'd be talking about Pav Bhaji index, I would never have believed it. So I want to
I want to just jump in there. So I think my sense is economics is basically very simple. It's about economics means household management. That's what the term means. And the best way to learn about economics is to see what people are doing in their day-to-day life. I think if you are a keen observer of that, inherently you become a good economist, in my view. So talking to your mom, talking to your maid, when I was in India, talking to, we had a person who was driving the car for me in India, we call them drivers. So, talking to your drivers, these are the most important sources of economic information, because, sometimes aggregate statistics don't make sense because they are too aggregate, but you have to go to the last mile and figure out what's happening in that person's life, what are the issues that they are talking about. And once you start sampling enough of the population that way, you kind of feel the pulse of what's happening in the economy. So, okay, sorry.
When does the next Pav Bhaji print come out? The Pav.
So it's always the 12th of each month in India.
Okay, awesome.
So I used to have a spreadsheet that used to construct that index out, but it can be your favorite food, it can be a dosa index or samosa index or parota index or whatever you want to get.
So I also want to talk about India's role in the world. Many people are saying it's an emerging financial superpower, and I want to also try to understand, if India becomes one of the great financial superpowers of the century, what kind of leader is it going to be? Because right now in the US, we've kind of posed this Russia-Ukraine thing as democracies versus autocracies. But the largest democracy in the world hasn't put many sanctions, or if any sanctions at all, on Russia, and is actually giving them a lot of breathing room through these trade agreements for food and wheat and all these other things. So how, from a US-centric point of view, should we try to understand India's rise and what that means in terms of its priorities for the world?
Yeah. So I think it's a very deep and interesting question. Hard to give like a very clear answer, but let me make 3 quick points. One, the whole geopolitics of the world has become a bit functional and focused on each country's needs rather than sort of cooperative world trade agreements, etc. In my view, a lot of damage got done during the recent tariff and trade wars, even though some of it was justified because of certain kinds of policies that China had in place to manage its currency and boost its own exports relative to the rest of the world. But I think the manner in which it has happened has, I think, caused a lot of geopolitical damage to that consensus that the world will function in a cooperative way. So in a way, what India has said is, we will see what is the best for us. Fuel is a very big part also of Indian inflation. India imports most of what it needs in terms of its oil consumption. It used to import a lot from the Gulf countries, including Iran. And so it has now switched heavily, I believe, close to 25% or even more of its supplies to Russia, because Russia doesn't have as many buyers and it's willing to give huge discounts to India. So that's one point, which is that India is saying, listen, the way the new norms are, everyone's doing what's best for each country, and so will I. Second, India has always been cut an exception when it came to sanctions on oil countries. So whenever US has imposed sanctions on Iran, India has always been allowed to bypass the sanctions because oil is an essential part of the basket. US Treasury realizes India is importing a very big part of it. So in some ways, I would say what the West and the US have done in giving exceptions to India is actually more in line with what has been done in the past. Of course, in this case, sometimes sanctions on Iran were not born out of an actual act of aggression. They were more as for deterrence against nuclear power development, etc. Here, of course, there's an explicit act of aggression, and so maybe it's perhaps more questionable, but I would say, viewed through some lens, what the West has done is also not terribly out of line with what it has done in the past. I think the third point that I would make is that India is now a very large country. It's a very large consumption for the rest of the world in terms of the size of the economy, close to $3 trillion. So a lot of countries, a lot of companies all over the world, they don't want to be in a situation where 1, 2, or 3 of the large emerging markets which are growing fast are somehow excluded from the trade that they can do with them. So my sense is the decision of these countries is not just political; it is also actually business oriented. I think that their commerce bodies, their tech services sector, their large infrastructure companies, they are all saying, listen, this is where the growth is. We have made big investments in many cases. We can't just displease some of these trade partners. And I think India realizes that India is important now. It's much bigger than what it used to be, and so, you know, I think my sense is it's all sort of geopolitical, and as Lyndon Johnson used to say, it's all politics. It's not personal.
Right.
So I think it's that means, of course, each one of us, I'm sure, has our own views on this, given the humanitarian tragedy that's underway. But you know, unfortunately, politics and humanitarian things don't always go hand in hand.
Awesome. I'm gonna open up for Q&A. We have about 10-15 minutes. I'll call on some people. So yeah, any questions?
I was just wondering, firstly, thank you for talking, but I was just wondering which industries you see India expanding the most into.
Yeah, I would say by and large services is where I just see tremendous growth. Of course, tech services remains India's poster child as far as opportunities, high quality of execution, not so much of the dark stuff I was talking about, you know, relatively clean operations, clean balance sheets, not that much debt, so, you know, you are not saddled with banking issues and so on. So many positives on tech services, but I would say services more generally, like think about e-commerce and what it's doing in India. You know, so much logistics revolution is taking place on ground. Simple things like every truck having a barcode, so that when they are leaving a warehouse and coming out, crossing a particular junction, you have a record that the truck has gone in and out at what point of time. Then you can optimize on your logistics delivery. So simple things like, I met someone in a flight recently who is just doing this, you know, essentially providing barcoding service and executing it on a large body of trucks all over the country. I mean, it's a phenomenally successful business, she said, you know, they are doing extremely well just providing that logistics services. And I think there is a very big shift which is so refreshing when I go back to India, which is that, see, in 90s after the economy opened up, the first wave of tech entrepreneurs was all about maintaining softwares for the rest of the world. So the likes of Infosys, Patni Consultancy, Tata Consultancy, etc., Wipro, they were doing most of the time it was just implementing SAP, which is like an enterprise software for the rest of the world. And you know, we had a body of engineers willing to go wherever in the world, work as many hours as needed. They'll immigrate to any country other than, as long as it wasn't coming back to India, they were willing to go. And 90s was very different. But that was the first wave of entrepreneurs. Now, of course, most Indians want to go back, or many Indians want to go back. The second wave of entrepreneurs was saying, listen, now we have some skills on how to manage these large projects. We have trust, we know how to work with these companies abroad. Let's develop softwares for them. So not just I will take software developed by a German company, SAP, and customize it and implement it for other companies. We will develop software for foreign companies. So, for example, one of my wingmates from IIT Bombay, he's developed a very, very successful unicorn company, which is essentially developing software for processing patient data of GE Health, Mayo Clinic, and other health companies here. You know, he has an office in Princeton, in Texas, and in Bangalore, and in Mumbai, and so on. But now the third wave of entrepreneurs in India now in this service space is saying, I want to develop software and apps for the Indian consumer. Now they are not serving just foreign companies, they are saying, let's now revolutionize the consumption of India, let's revolutionize the delivery in India, let's make a greater variety of products available, let's make it easy for the consumer to curate what they want. And I think this is very refreshing in my view, because now we will probably get sort of India-focused, India-specific, unique solutions which are like unlocking opportunity and growth. So to me, this is like, I'm not saying just tech, but services in general is where I think there's tremendous opportunity. It's also the easy part of the economy to work. You will see that there are many more new names in this sector than in the traditional sectors where the same 4 or 5 names keep coming up every now and then. I call it BATA. You can figure out what B, A, T, and A is. But yeah, I would say that to me is the most promising question. Okay, I'll have to keep my answers brief. Yeah, you can see I haven't been given a chance to speak since I've left the central bank. You know, I have a captive audience. Yes.
Professor, thank you for speaking with us today. I have a multi-part, somewhat technical question about central bank digital currencies. So first, what are your views on central bank digital currencies? There's also rumors that the BRICS countries are working on something together. How can central bank digital currencies be used in India, and what could be the benefit for financial inclusion?
So the question's about central bank digital currencies.
No, that's a whole topic in itself. I won't be able to touch upon everything, but if you go to my website under research and short articles and interviews, there's actually a panel we had done here with Professor Darrell Duffy of Stanford and Dr. Subba Rao, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. I was the moderator, but you can see that I like to talk, so I was talking quite a bit myself in that panel. But you might want to look at that YouTube video, I think, because they spoke very eloquently on this theme. So the central bank digital currency, as I see it, is a way for people to save money electronically. And one problem in the United States has been that banks have been very slow with digital stuff. Like, I was doing digital transactions at a faster pace and more commonly in India than I was in the US actually. But what that does is that it has created this whole wave of wallets, but private digital currencies, stable coins, crypto assets, and the regulators are losing control over who's investing what, where, which of these are small versus large, which are going to have a run because the coin was supposed to be stable but really wasn't that stable. And so, it's a whole parallel universe of currency management that they were used to doing with banks that is now partly all settlement and payments is happening in a parallel system that the regulators don't have control over. So a part of the thinking behind central bank digital currency is to say that if the benefit of that parallel world is that it's digital and our banks are for whatever reason not doing a great job of it, let's offer a central bank digital currency as an alternative to the people. And at least the part of the stuff that's just because of wanting a digital option can switch to that central bank digital currency. The regulators will have a better sense of the flows of currency. They can regulate it the way they want, maintain its sanctity and integrity and so on. Now there's a part of stuff happening in crypto which is just related to opaque transactions. That will probably not move to central bank digital currency. And the last point I would say here is that by continuing that line of thinking, in my view, India on one front doesn't really need a central bank digital currency because it has a great payment system already. India developed what is called as a unified payments interface. It was developed as a public good rather than one individual bank providing its own payment service, and it functions beautifully. All banks and others are connected to the same payment system. So I don't see why to do digital transactions anyone needs anything in India other than working through the UPI as it's called. Now where India probably can benefit from CBDC is that many Indian companies and individuals like your parents sending the tuition to NYU, they are doing foreign transactions. Foreign exchange transactions are very expensive with banking, with global banks. They charge between 2 to 3% for just doing the exchange. And part of the hope is that these transactions can happen faster and at lower rates if they are done through a central bank digital currency floated by the Reserve Bank rather than having to go through the global dollar-based payment and settlement system. But take a look at that YouTube link. If you don't find it, send me an email and I'll send you the link.
Yeah, let's Alright, thank you for speaking. So, you kind of touched on India's protectionism when it comes to agriculture. I know India has protectionism in a lot of other industries as well. Like, what are like your opinions on it? You think India would be better off if they moved to a more free trade type system?
Yeah, absolutely. So India, like I think what is being said is that India basically has a lot of tariffs. So the taxes, the import taxes imposed on goods which are coming from outside are very high. So an Apple phone in India costs a lot more if you convert it into dollars than to get it in dollar terms here. And so many other things. And you know what that does is that it keeps the domestic companies profitable because they can produce substandard goods and not have to compete with foreign goods. You could justify it based on creating local jobs, but you can also see that it has the downside of not then having globally competitive industries. So you know they are surviving because they produce domestic goods, but not necessarily foreign goods. So I would say India should actually remove tariffs in a very significant way. It should be a bit more open to creative destruction of its large, fat incumbents, which have sort of really grown on back of these tariffs. India also has a lot of protectionism of implicit type, which is that the big industrial firms are growing very large. So I just want to put it in perspective. Relative in 80s, concentration was very high in India because everything was government owned. So in a relative sense, concentration has been broken down now because a lot of privatization has happened. But over the last 10 years, I would say since global financial crisis, but more in the last 10 years, now concentration is rising in the private sector of the economy. 5 to 10 industrial houses, 5 especially, are becoming very large in many different sectors. So their pricing power is increasing. They are, you know, it's called the usual suspects problem. All allocations are happening to the usual suspects, you know, like just as a sort of very weird thought, if you woke up in the morning and someone had to sell your garments to someone, who would they go to in India? I can tell you who the primary contenders are. You know, the government would sell it off to 4 or 5 of these large firms. Now, why is core inflation high? Is it high because firms have pricing power and they are able to constantly gouge the consumers with higher markups? So all of these are very important issues, and I would be in favor of removing both explicitly the tariffs, removing the implicit favoritism of the large industrial firms. I would go even a further and make it very hard for them to actually create these complex organization structures where they keep doing related party transactions in between. No one really knows what money is flowing through which arm of the large companies in any way. I would even make it one option would be to break them up by fiat, but even if you didn't go that far, you could make it hard for them, like through various kinds of taxes on related party transactions, so that you don't have these sort of Byzantine structures of corporate organization.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. It was a phenomenal question.
I'm okay if you want to continue, but
Okay.
yeah, I'm okay till 5 minutes before 2.
Oh, okay, great.
At 2 I have a deadline, and
Okay,
5
Steve,
minutes
you
before
get
2.
your hand up.
Yeah, so hi Viralji, thank you for your comments. I just wanted to ask you, with continuous fiscal discipline and an increase in capex spending by the government, do you think India has the potential to reach a $5 trillion economy in the next 5 years?
The potential is always there, you know. So I think the question is, when do we achieve it? Do we achieve it without a lot of bumps along the way? And some of the things in the budget are actually laudable. I think they are trying to cut back on subsidies. They have scaled back at least on COVID time subsidies. They are shifting more into capital expenditures. I think the one caveat is that what the central government is doing is that it's reducing the cesses which are distributed to the states. So the central government is keeping more of the taxes with itself, so that it can keep doing more programs and put them on your gas station billboard, to see. So there's a bit of that sort of the cooperative federalist structure that India has between the center and the states. My sense is it's coming under a bit of pressure because the center is partly trying to show better fiscal deficit numbers of the central government by squeezing the states on the taxes that it's transferring down to the states. But otherwise, some of infrastructure has to happen on government balance sheet. I think private capital expenditure is still not where it should be. The replacement capex is happening, but new capex is not happening at a fast enough pace.
Black in the back.
As you said, India has like a lot of booms and busts in their financial cycle. So how would you suggest a more steady, because a lot of these companies lend out infrastructure loans, you have high non-performing assets, and they spend the next 6 years undercapitalized and trying to solve it. Plus, one more thing is, the Indian government introduced the IBC, the Indian Bankruptcy Code, which kind of turned out to be a failure. Increased times for bankruptcies for most cases. So how do you get it to like a system in the United States where you have Chapter 11 bankruptcy, so liquidation is easy, and you get a lot of the value of the assets, allowing creative disruption to happen?
So yeah, there's a lot in there. I would say, like in the book that was mentioned, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, I tried to spell this out a little bit, but it's all connected. You have to reduce the fiscal deficits so that borrowing costs for others, private firms in the economy are low. I think we have to privatize many of our public sector banks so that government's ability to influence lending around an election cycle is not that high. And we have to have the central bank resist the government pressures to go light on banks in terms of underwriting and lending standards and instead run a tight ship, so to speak. I think the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, even to date, has done better than the previous codes. It's still, as you said, failing on fast resolution as per the original mandate, but it's still faster than what the previous codes was. So I wouldn't say it's been a failure. I think it has not been where perhaps it could have been, but it has actually been a big part of how I think we cleaned up the banks over the last 10 years. So many things are going in the right direction, but lowering the general fiscal deficit, opening up bond markets via that, and then privatizing the public sector banks still remain an unfinished agenda, I would say. A couple of questions.
Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking with us. You mentioned that like a lot of these big businessmen and industrialists are sort of keen to like making black money flow to the market and for insider trading, but a lot of them are also like really, they have been like establishing these projects that have like been helping boost India's economy. So what would you say like their role is in India and as well as like in tangential to the government to sort of restore India's financial stability?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So I hope I'm not conveying that India's businessmen only do the wrong stuff. Means clearly they are executing very large projects on ground. Like think about the rollout of Geo, think about the various ports and airports. Delhi airport and Mumbai airport now look like among the best airports in the world. So clearly they are executing things on the ground. The question is, does one, however, necessarily need to give them almost like this kind of market power and preferential access? That's one. Second, if some of them are engaging in insider trading, of course they should be held accountable because that destroys the sanctity of the market. It happens at the cost of the sort of the minority investors, etc. And I think the third and the big question to which I don't have an answer to, but it's an interesting question that has been posed recently, is that earlier India used to develop infrastructure through its own government-owned companies, but they were very bad. They were not delivering, they were not executing, corruption was high, delays were very high, and efficiency was low. Now India is developing infrastructure through private companies, but increasingly it looks like it's doing through a few chosen national champions. And the question is whether the government is essentially running an industrial policy which is centralized, but saying, listen, if I have to do it through my own enterprises or my own ministries, it's both inefficient and slow. So let me now cherry pick the national champions and basically do it via them, because I can just tell them, go and acquire this port, go and build this airport, go and build this cricket stadium. And they get fast execution. Sometimes the projects may not make sense, but still these industrialists go ahead and have to do it because they realize this is all a package of being a national champion. And then sometimes I wonder if because they are doing stuff that they would rather not do, then they are trying to cut corners on the side. saying, listen, I still have to be profitable, I still want to be the wealthiest guy and top 10 or whatever in the world and so on.
Can I just ask a
Yeah, yeah.
follow-up? So, like with the national elections coming, do you feel that a change in political power would sort of affect these businessmen, and how would that affect India's economy?
I don't think so. They're just so large in a way. I think my sense is, I think I think the question mark with political shifts in India is really going to be whether we continue to move a little bit backwards towards being like a centralized economy with large sort of business hegemonies in the system, or do we want a little bit more institutionalized, decentralized economy where entry for new players is a little easy, small business things, they can become big not just in tech services but also in infrastructure and construction and so on. My worry is that those who became big through the traditional industries, now they are also entering tech services and things like that, and that's my worry, which is whether now they will just steamroll over all the smaller players who are out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to go back to you talking about the Reserve Bank of India. So I know that you were talking about how like, there's not as much political, I guess, independence, if you will. So is this a result of just there's no protections or legal laws in place like the U.S., or are they just not being followed? And what do you think India can do to make sure that that independence either improves or is recognized legally and in the political system?
Right. So I would say that the legal act of the Reserve Bank of India is actually pretty weak. It doesn't grant the institution as much autonomy as one would like. It was of course written by the British in 1932 or 33 when Reserve Bank was set up. And over time, of course, there are amendments to the act, some hopefully mostly in the right direction. But so what has happened over a period of time is that when things work well, which is that effectively there is independence, it is because the cast of characters figures it out right. But because the legal independence is weak, if the cast of characters is not right, then things don't turn out to be right. And ideally, you don't want, in an institutionalized setting, you don't want that the cast of characters matters for this outcome. It should really be driven by, what are the operational autonomy principles, what stays with the government or the finance ministry, what is the remit of the central bank, and then, there should be clear separation of power. There's a reason why the Reserve Bank of India office is in Mumbai and not in the building, the North Block, which is where the finance ministry is, because the Reserve Bank is not an executive arm of the government. It's a separate regulator like the judiciary or the tax collection agency or the law enforcement agency or the criminal bureau of investigation and so on. So what can be done? The IMF has a report called the FSAP, which was done I think in 2017-18. My book and its prelude chapter also lays out some of the important legal changes that may be desirable. One big hurdle is that the Reserve Bank can regulate private banks almost like it has full powers. So just like FDIC can auction off a bank that has failed to prevent it from being run upon, the Reserve Bank can do that for a private bank. But when it comes to a public sector bank, the Reserve Bank has no such authority. The government, the ministry have to get involved. It would be better if they were just like an arm's length equity investor rather than now being legally enshrined to deal with the resolution of a bank. Because what gives the Treasury or the Finance Ministry of India any capacity or expertise to deal with the resolution of banks and financial firms? But these are some of the legal impediments to strengthening the independence of the central bank.
Okay, so we do have to finish up to let people go to class. If you have more questions, just feel free
Okay,
to come up
maybe
here.
a rapid fire. Yeah.
Rapid fire? Okay.
Yeah, so I have a question. It was basically on soft lending. I know that that's the best case scenario for this year and for inflation in general. But say I think there's a lot of data that also predicts that
will not happen, and say that best case scenario does not come to life, what is the impact of that on emerging economies, especially India?
Yeah, most likely it will result in greater capital outflows because that means the US rates will have to rise more. Capital outflows can happen even if US cuts rates but volatility is high, then there's a risk off and emerging market pull off happens. That means emerging market central banks like the Reserve Bank will have to be ready with their reserves to step in and manage that volatility when the capital outflows are happening. Foreign borrowing of companies may be harder and more expensive. They will have to then resort to domestic funds, but government is constantly running high fiscal deficits, which makes it hard for Indian companies to compete domestically to raise money cheap.
So, follow up on that, would you say that that would kind of be start a tumble of other emerging economies also starting to see themselves?
It's possible, I think. Yeah, it certainly tightens global financial conditions. Yeah. Yes, you had. I think the other person left.
So I just want to go back to what you said about Indian 90s had an interview with engineers ready to work on tech. I think we still do. And I'd like to know, do you think we should channel their energy into a specific area here? We have a national election coming up next year, so maybe trying to combat fake news would help, or maybe just going for a broader frame and helping streamline just like student production or something of that sort. Like, what do you think tech people should focus their energy on right now?
You mean when you say people, you mean the government or?
Not really. Like just maybe individuals or people who are planning on working in that area. Maybe the government might pick them up later. But where do you have an area where we need innovation in the coming years to sort of help push towards a superpower for the nation?
I think, see, at a very macro level, see, it doesn't make sense that 45 to 50% of India's labor is in farming. So we basically, at a macro level, we need to do something to make agriculture more efficient, more machine-based, more aggregated up, less in smaller plots of land, smaller farmers, individual tillers rather than machine-based tilling. And we need to move that workforce into services where India has a tremendous opportunity. We need to educate that workforce. We need to ensure the new workforce is not going there, but instead entering sort of higher end, higher skilled jobs. That's the transformation that has to take place. Software industry inflation in India on salaries is between 10 to 35% depending upon where you start. It's like between 10 to 15% at the lowest software job. That's a very high inflation. It can only be because there's a scarcity of skills in India relative to the demand from the rest of the world. And we have the population, but we are not transferring them into that high-skilled industry. So I think to me that's the big transformation that has to happen in our workforce, from farming into higher end, higher paying, higher skilled jobs. Yes.
So how closely does the RBI collaborate with the international counterparts, and how do political pressures get in the way or affect the relationship?
How do political
pressures?
Yeah.
So how does RBI work with other international central banks, and how does politics play a role?
I think RBI cooperates extremely well. It's a very well-respected central bank. There are these fora like IMF and G20 meetings in April and October every year. There's the Bank for International Settlement meetings. There are meetings amongst governors of central banks. There are meetings amongst deputy governors of central banks. These are all settings through which we cooperate, we exchange skills and expertise and knowledge. We discuss and brainstorm issues of international and domestic importance. And I would say Reserve Bank could probably play an even bigger role going forward. Maybe it needs more staff down the line, beyond governor and deputy governors who have the skill set actually to contribute in these conversations. But overall, I would say the Reserve Bank of India as an institution is extremely well run. The staff is of very high integrity, very hardworking, very well skilled. And I think for what RBI does, given what it has, I say, really well done. Okay, let's take one really last question. I think. Yeah.
You mentioned early on that the basically the economic development of India is marred by political cycles. So like politicians invest a lot when elections are coming up. Do you think that that cycle can ever be broken? Because politics has always been sort of tied to like how India institutes policy since like 1947, right?
But I think that's the question, which is at what point do we stop being sort of the centralized, socialist, bank-driven, government-driven economy to a decentralized, capitalist, market-based economy. I think many economies, as they grow and they reach a certain per capita GDP like 5,000 or 10,000 per dollars per person, they have to make these transitions. But you can't just reach that level and then make the transition one day. You have to like gradually move in that direction. And a lot of countries get trapped. It's called a middle income trap because they are not able to switch from being a government controlled, bank dominated, centralized economy to becoming a more market oriented, decentralized economy. Many countries fail at that step. And therefore they are not able to become a United States or a Denmark, as they call it. You know, they are getting stuck in the middle. So I think we have to aspire at least to make that transition. As I said, I think there are things that government should provide, and I think those are public goods in my opinion: infrastructure, health, and education. I think these are the three things government should first and foremost focus on. But we don't do much on either. On infrastructure we have improved, but on health and education our spend is still extremely very little actually. So we are not spending on public goods. We are busy giving things like, you know, things that can be supplied privately. We are giving subsidies to industries, whereas we should let industries figure out what's a reasonable cost of production, optimize on that, and then figure out therefore what they should produce, how much, etc. But instead we are very busy giving subsidies of that type rather than developing the public good infrastructure that the country needs. So I think we have to make that transition. We were making that transition, and I think we have reversed in the last 10 years in my view. And I think that's to me a bigger concern than the fact that, oh, we haven't reached all the way. That doesn't worry me. I don't think we would have reached all the way even if we had kept moving in the right direction. But we have actually reversed, and we are becoming more centralized, more bank dominated, more government controlled economy relative to where we were, say, in 2007, for example. Okay, thank you so much.